So, my introduction to Tom. Tom Kaye is Executive Director and Senior Ecologist at the Institute for Applied Ecology, a nonprofit organization with a mission to conserve native habitats and species through research, restoration, and education. He is also a Courtesy Associate Professor in the Department of Botany and Plant Pathology at OSU. Tom conducts research on rare species, reintroductions, pollination biology, habitat restoration, plant invasions, plant propagation responses to climate change, and engages prison inmates in conservation through the Sagebrush in Prisons project. And in his spare time, he figures out how to download his PowerPoint from the internet. Sourcing native plants for restoration is a key area of interest, research, and publication for Dr. Kaye. He serves as a board member for the Society for Ecological Restoration and is a commission member on the IUCN space, SSC space, Seed Conservation Specialist Group. And if you're not familiar with the Institute for Applied Ecology, it is a nonprofit organization based in Corvallis on Jefferson?
And 6th.
Jefferson and 6th. And in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with a mission to conserve native species and habitats through restoration, research, and education. The Institute conducts on-the-ground conservation and specializes in endangered species rewilding and recovery. Please welcome Dr. Tom Kaye.
Can you hear me? Is this working? If I go like this, can you hear me? No. Okay. People in the front row can hear me shout. It might be awkward to stand like this.
Let me try back here first.
It was on my collar. Is that
Hang on.
something? Okay, the people in the back row, if you can hear me, nod. Everybody else doesn't matter. Okay, good. All right, seems to be working. Great, technology. Welcome, everybody. I'm really amazed to see how many people came today. Thank you. I'm grateful. I am Tom Kaye, and as Janet mentioned, I'm the Executive Director at the Institute for Applied Ecology, and we're a nonprofit organization in Corvallis. Our mission is to conserve native species and habitats, and we do that through restoration, research, and education. We're very busy in all of those areas. We also have a vision. Our vision of the world, writ large, is a world where all people and wildlands are healthy and interact positively. So people and nature are working together. Biological diversity flourishes. I'm going to say more about biological diversity in a minute. And environmental challenges are met with a social commitment to solving problems with scientific principles. So we believe in science, and we believe in putting it to work for us all. As an organization, we work both in the Pacific Northwest and in the Southwest. And in fact, some of our programs are nationwide or very broadly regional. For example, our Sagebrush in Prisons project works throughout the Great Basin in the West. And Project Botany, which is developing curriculums, is national. The Native Seed Network, where we're working with seed growers and practitioners all across the country, is national. In fact, we're having a national native seed conference in Washington, D.C. in 2 months. So you believe there's that many people that want to get together and just talk about native seeds, like 400 of them all at once, etc. Here's our staff. This is our most recent post-COVID, at least post everybody wearing a mask wherever they are, picture, so you can see what people look like. It's also a lot of change. During the pandemic, like many organizations, we had a certain amount of turnover. It's been a time of both loss and saying goodbye to people, and excitement and building new teams. So there's an upside. Here's our board of directors, and Sunya Yang, I think, is in the audience. Thank you for coming, Sunya. She's one of our board members. Any other board members here? No? All right. Interns, we work with interns and technicians a lot. This is some of the faces of internships we've had in the past. So although our mission is largely focused on nature conservation, we also embrace our role as an organization that can help people enter the field of conservation and go on to careers in this area. We work with endangered species, recovering endangered species. Recovery means trying to get them to the point where they don't need to be on the endangered species list. And we do a lot of that. In fact, for plants, I think we do more of this than any other organization I know of in the country. These are some of the species, plants and animals that we work with. Some of these, like this one right here, has already been removed from the endangered species list in shared measure to the work we do to recover it. This species here is Nelson's checker mallow. It's proposed for being removed from the endangered species list, and so on. So our work makes an impact. We are also deep into butterfly conservation. And as you probably know, butterflies depend on plants, right? So a lot of what we do is aimed at improving the vegetation for wildlife or for the plants themselves. And I think of butterflies as botanists. I mean, because they're flying around, and what are they doing? In addition to looking for mates, they're looking for plants. And not just any plant, they have to identify plants. So the Taylor's checker spot, for example, which is an endangered species, occurs here in Benton County, is linked to English plantain. That's where it lays its eggs, and its larvae feed on the English plantain. The Fender's blue butterfly, also here in Benton County and throughout the Willamette Valley, feeds on Kincaid's lupin. The Oregon silver spot butterfly, over on the coast, like at Cascade Head, feeds on early blue violet. And monarchs, as you probably know, feed on milkweeds. So these butterflies are linked to their habitats. They cannot be removed from the endangered species list or otherwise helped without providing food for them. And the key food is the larval food, the plants they lay their eggs on. They also need nectar from other wildflowers, but without the host plant, you can't have them. We also do bird conservation, and these birds are all linked to habitats as well. I don't have a list of habitats, but the western meadowlark, streaked hornlark, vesper sparrow, slender-billed white-breasted nuthatch. These are all species of Benton County and surrounding areas in the Willamette Valley that require healthy grassland or oak woodlands to survive. They must have them. We also really get into pollinator conservation. We're on year 5 coming up of a major pollinator study in the Willamette Valley to understand what the major bees and flies and other insects that are visiting flowers do and who are they and how they vary through time and space. So I won't talk about that right now, but it's really fun. We can talk about that another time. And then we really get into habitat restoration. We do on-the-ground work. We're not just a planner organization. And I don't mean to put down organizations that plan. We need plans, and we do make plans. But we also get our hands dirty and our boots dirty. And we use a lot of different tools to restore habitats, especially prairies locally. And it's hard, because prairies are largely degraded with European and Asian weeds. And we have to get rid of those in order to get what we do want. And that's a lot of work. So when invasives come in, they make a lot of work for us to restore habitats and make them healthy again. So we use tools like herbicides sometimes, but we also use fire, we use mowing, and we use whatever tools we can get our hands on that's appropriate for the situation. And then on top of that, we overlay seeds. So we put a lot of native seeds out on the ground. And as an organization, we depend on members, we depend on donors. So this is the end of my pitch to you about what we do as an organization, and then we'll get more into the climate change talk. But if you're so inspired to get involved or donate, you can go to our website at appliedeco.org. Applied Eco rhymes with Zydeco, and you can make a donation. So, climate change, diversity. First off, diversity is the spice of life. We all know that, right? And what's an interesting thing about plant diversity is ecologists have long referred to plant diversity at a particular location as species richness. species richness, like it has this value, this wonderful quality of empowerment. But for a long time, ecologists didn't have a way to quantify that. Is it like, well, why? Why is having diversity so great? Well, we can think of stories, but in the last 20 years, the research has been done to actually determine what happens when we have higher diversity in an ecosystem, higher diversity of plants. And often what happens is the productivity of the ecosystem, the primary productivity, plants are the base of the food chain, right? So, because they're taking sunlight and converting it into food. That makes them the base of the food chain. And when you have lots of plants, that base of the food chain becomes more stable through time. It's kind of like the stock market. If you have a diverse portfolio, you're going to be more stable through time in your investment than if you just have one or two stocks. It's going to go up and down with the vagaries of certain businesses. And maybe you can tolerate that as an investor, but probably not. Same thing in an ecosystem. If you have large swings in productivity, that makes the ecosystem weak. It makes it hard to support all the other organisms that are feeding on those plants. And so when you have lots of different species of plants, that's actually the driver of diversity of all of the other species of animals in the ecosystem. Pollinators, mammals, you name it, underground organisms, the bacteria in the soil, all of that is driven by the diversity of plants above ground. Now, this particular slide here doesn't show you a lot of diversity, but this is the initial stage in a restored prairie just south of Philomath. And the plant here is tarweed, which is a culturally significant plant to the Kalapuya. The seeds were harvested after fires and ground up into flour and made into food. So today, though, I'm going to really talk to you about three main messages. That climate change is affecting native plants today, already today, and forward. It's not something we're waiting for. It's something that's actually already happened, and we're in the process. That nature is important to human health. So when climate change affects plants, it affects our health too, directly, for a number of reasons, and we'll get into that. And climate-centered restoration is crucial. We have to be thinking about the climate as we're restoring habitats. Because in order to make restored habitats that have any future, we have to be thinking about how we're bolstering the plants in those ecosystems so that they can be resilient in time. So that's my message. I'll stop there. No, I'm kidding. So, welcome to the Anthropocene. Here's Earth. We've pumped so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we've changed the conditions down on the ground by the greenhouse effect. I'm sure all of you know this. And that has led some people to describe the geologic period we're in as the Anthropocene. I always thought it was called the Holocene, but now we're calling it the Anthropocene to recognize that humans are actually driving changes on the Earth that are marking it for a long time. So, whoever's here in the future will be able to see our effects because of human activity. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this kind of graph here showing that temperature has been going up. We get to about the present here, and it's forecasted to continue to go up. So, while we see events like heat domes and odd winters and storms, and we think, God, this climate change is hard. The sad truth is we ain't seen nothing yet. So we have to brace ourselves for that. And then we look at precipitation. This is in some ways more interesting or fascinating because these graphs are actually the compilation of many different climate models that are attempting to predict the future. And so there's uncertainty around them, these sort of shaded areas, right? Well, it'll probably get hotter, it might be this good. I mean, it was not really exact. There's uncertainty. So you take a bunch of models and you average them out, and make an ensemble model, and you get this kind of line here. But look what's happening with precipitation. It's been quite variable in the past. And is it likely to change? Well, one way to look at this is it's not likely to change. It's just going to stay sort of variable the way it was. Another way to look at it is we don't know. So these models actually don't agree on how precipitation might change locally. But even if it does stay the same amount of moisture here in Oregon that we're used to, it will still be drier. Because as it heats up, that moisture becomes less available. It gets baked out of the soil faster through evapotranspiration. So in gardens and natural areas, there is just going to be less water in the soil because of evapotranspiration, because it's hotter, even if there's the same amount of moisture falling in the ground. So here are some of the effects of climate change on plants that we know about already. There's a loss of diversity, and we know diversity is key to ecosystem function, to environmental health. It's absolutely the key. And so we're seeing losses of diversity, and that's something we need to pay attention to. We need to reverse. There's changes in phenology, the timing of major life history events in plants, like flowering, that things are blooming earlier, they're going to seed earlier, etc. There are range shifts, and I mean geographical ranges where organisms occur on the landscape. That is changing over time. Plants are starting to move, or if they're not, their habitat is moving and they're failing to track it. Species extinctions are happening. We're actually seeing species just drop out from parts of the landscape due to climate change already. And there are complex interactions with land use. The effects of climate change may be different in lands managed one way versus another. Intensive resource extraction, like grazing, might exacerbate or aggravate the effects of climate change. So diversity is in decline because of climate change. And here's one example of that. So this is from a study in southwestern Oregon, where some folks went back to plots that had been established by this ecologist named Robert Whitaker. And they resampled the same plots to find out how many species were there and what the vegetation looked like, etc. And what they found was that compared to, from 1950 compared to 2007, when they did this field work, the number of species found in these plots declined by, what, 70%? Just the number of species. So, but of course the story's got some nuance and some complexity to it. The species that declined the most were those that generally occur in the north. So it's gotten hotter, so their southern range of their geographic distribution has sort of been trimmed off and it's moving north. So they've dropped down. Endemic species that don't occur anywhere but there in the whole world, they're starting to disappear. Excuse me. And there's this interesting shift to southern type and south-facing communities. So on north-facing communities, some of the southern species are shifting around to those to kind of escape being baked out of their habitat. So yes, we're losing species diversity, but there's all these interesting and quirky dynamics going on that explain what's really happening. A study where folks went back to old data to make a comparison, but what they did here is they went through herbarium collections. And herbarium collections are plant specimens that are pressed, glued to a piece of paper with a label, and then put in shelves in a room called a herbarium, basically a plant morgue. You open the door, slide out the cadaver, read the label, and you can determine a lot of information from that, because you know exactly when it was collected, where it was collected, and what condition it was in. Was it flowering or not? So we can actually track how plants have changed on average, the dates at which they're flowering, by revisiting these museums that contain all this information. And so these folks in 2020 went back and they did all this, and they found on average there's a 4.4 days shift per 1 degree centigrade increase in temperature. In other words, plants are blooming a little bit earlier every time it gets warmer. And here's some nuance to that too. The things that bloom early in the season are blooming earlier than those things that bloom later. So their shift is actually sort of more dramatic than things that kind of bloom later in the summer. Things at the lower elevations and in maritime environments are shifting earlier the most. So this number here is an average. For individual groups of species, it's more. and other groups it's less. And other groups where it's less is things that bloom late already in the year are shifting less. They're already blooming in the summer. It's like, I'm used to just blooming hot, whatever. The things at high elevations and in arid lands are shifting less. That's really interesting. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer here. There is complexity to this. And again, these data are from 100 years, 1901 to 2015 is this period of time they looked at. So also, ranges may need to shift with climate change, and may be changing already. So here's another study on that. So this was research that's been done down at the University of Oregon and other collaborators. And what these people did is they set up these, I can't really point it out there, but they set up 3 experimental situations. It replicated 3 places. One thing they did was they added heat. So they had a control where they didn't do anything, but then another one, they had these heaters that just actually warmed up the ground. They also had rainout shelters to manipulate the amount of precipitation that got into sites. So they could really kind of control the environment the plants were experiencing and imitate what the climate might look like in the future. But they did this over a latitude gradient from southern Oregon all the way up into the Puget Sound area. So there's a southern, central, and northern place where they looked at this. So that's the experimental design setup. And they've published all kinds of papers off this. But what I want to point out to you is just a couple of results. So species like this Romer's fescue, and this sunflower species here, and this grass called California oak grass, these all declined with heating and drought. So these are species that are common here in the Willamette Valley, in native prairies, and so the advanced signal from this study is these species are going to start to decline and disappear from the environment. But another important aspect of it is, these are species that they actually moved from the southern part of their study area to the northern part. They weren't already native in the northern part, but they moved them up there. And what they found was, when they were moved beyond their usual range limit, and then given a climate change environment, they did well. So they're suggesting that species like this may do well in climate change if we're able to help them move north. If we don't, they're likely to drop out. But if we do, then they're likely to adapt and do well in a new place. So species ranges are changing, and there's an opportunity for us to think about, well, what do we do about that? Do we intervene? Do we include species that are from the south in our northern plantings, etc.? Here's another study on sort of a similar message that trees may need to shift to survive and reproduce. This is a massive study that was done with, look at all these plots, something like 14,000 plots from California to Washington. And just to make this simple, anything down here that's sort of to the left of this vertical line are species whose seedlings prefer cooler temperatures than the adult trees. In other words, they go to a site and they find no seedlings. There's adult trees, but there are no seedlings. But that only happens in the hotter area, hotter part of the geographic range of the species, suggesting that the climate has already changed. The adult trees are still there, and they're still growing, but they're not able to reproduce because their seedlings can't establish. It has become too hot, too droughty for them. So that's alarming if you're interested in certain tree species, but it's also a message to us that these trees need to move. They need to track the climate. So that's something we as humans need to pay attention to and think about. Are we planting the right things in the right places for the long term? Here's a note on plant extinctions. So this is a study that we were engaged in with a plant called the clustered lady slipper, Cypripedium fasciculatum. And we revisited sites that had been reported up to 30 years ago. And so not a huge time window. Many of the populations of this species are relatively small, a few dozen plants or even fewer. And so we were returning to sites to determine, are they still there? And then we also wanted to ask what might be explaining their absence or presence over over time. And so this is an image of the kind of habitat the species grows in. It's a forest orchid. And these are some graphs, so bear with me. But population size, the larger the population size, the higher the higher the extinction probability. The lower the population size, the higher the extinction probability. In other words, small populations were more likely to disappear over time. Well, that's intuitive, makes sense. Also, when it's been a long time since anybody looked, it's more likely that these small populations have winked out. Well, that makes sense, because over time, it's more likely that bad things happen. Plants die out. But what is the climate change connection is that elevation was also a strong explanation. That those plants at higher elevations had a lower risk of extinction. Those plants at low areas, where it's warming up faster, those are the ones that have been trimmed out of the species distribution. So now we're going to say a little bit more about climate change and extinction, but now we're putting it in the context of land use. So this is a story with Green's Mariposa lily, Calochortus greenii, in southern Oregon. It's an endemic to way northern California and southern Oregon. What we did was we established plots and mapped and measured every single individual of this species in there and tracked them for 10 years. Some of these plots we put cages around to keep cows out, and some of them we didn't, so that we can compare grazed and ungrazed environments. And so then we built a climate and population model together. So first we put together the population model that looked at things like plant survival, growth, reproduction, dormancy. This is a lily with a bulb. Sometimes it takes a year off and just hangs out underground. So that's the population growth side of things. But we also looked at climate factors. So the precipitation and heat during spring, summer, fall, and winter. And then when we built after we built the population growth model, we looked for linkages, correlations between climatic or weather events and those aspects of life history. And what we then did was we connected the different environments in different seasons to the life history. And what we found was it's not simple. There are different responses in the population to different parts of the year. So as climate is changing, it's not just the population likes it or not. It's, well, the population likes certain conditions in the spring for survival, but individuals for reproduction prefer certain summer conditions. And then for growth, actually, they like certain fall conditions. And for dormancy, they also like fall conditions. And then spring also affects reproduction. So you can see it just gets to be a mess. You need a computer to figure this out, right? So we built the model it has climate drivers, and then we said, okay, if the climate is going to change in the future, according to these variables we've identified, how is the population likely to respond? And so in the top driver here was the minimum temperature in spring was the most important thing, because you can see it affects survival, it affects reproduction, and it affects dormancy. But they're all feeding into how the population dynamics, these complex processes are happening in these plant populations. Then we can throw in, well, okay, how does that change if there's cows grazing over the landscape? Okay, well, it sort of changes all the rules. It's a whole other model we had to put together. But we can then compare the two. So first off, if we look over here with cattle grazing, let's start at that one. The population model that links to climate found that in the future, this species is likely to decline and then maybe sort of level out. But there's a huge pink broad area that's uncertainty, right? So it could be bad, it could be medium. The blue line means if we didn't have cattle grazing, that's what's going to happen to the population. They're pretty similar, really statistically, they're not distinguishable, they look a little different. But if you go over here and you say, well, if we take out the cattle, now what's the effect of climate change? And the effect of climate change is actually either neutral or beneficial to the species under that circumstance. So how we're managing the land is going to determine how populations of these rare species, and actually many common species, are going to respond to climate change. So when we put stress on an environment, like through cattle grazing or other kinds of disturbances, we may make it harder for many populations of plants to assimilate and withstand climate change. In other words, we're adding insult to injury. All right, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about how how the environment is so good for humans. So this is I'm gonna look at this from a different lens now from what we've been talking about. So, I mean, we all know that going for a walk in the forest can really be calming and help us, right? Who hasn't done that? It's like, I need to get outside and just relax. And that's real. And we also know that as we see the places that we depend on for that nurturing, a fall to the chainsaw or to the housing development or to any other changes, that we feel a loss. I don't know, you probably do, I certainly do. And there's a term for that, it's called solastalgia. That means that grief we feel when our environment, our natural environment around us is lost. And you know, we juxtapose a beautiful forest to a copper pit mine, and you know, you can it's almost a violent feeling, right? That change in picture is like, that was hard. And we all know that inherently as humans. And it does affect us psychologically. Just being able to be out in nature and take a deep breath and look at the vista and experience the wild environment is important to us. It's important to our mental health. It has been shown also that for incarcerated people who are in prisons and do not get to get outside into nature, just showing them pictures of imagery of nature, can reduce their blood pressure, can reduce incidents of violence, make the prisons more safe. It seems stark and sad, but it shows how deeply connected humans are to the natural world, whether we know it or not on a daily basis. And this is just a picture to remind me to tell you about the Sagebrush in Prisons project that we run at about 10 different prisons throughout the West. And we work with prison inmates where they run a native plant nursery. They grow primarily sagebrush that is then planted onto public lands. And they have a lot of leadership, and no one's coerced to do this. Some of them are actually paid, depending on the state they're in. Prisons are run all differently throughout the country. And so these folks self-report improvements in mental health and physical health by being engaged in the program. And, of course, there's good research that shows when people are engaged in jobs in prison and learn skills, when they get out of prison, they are more able to get jobs and not recidivate, not go back to prison in just a few years. So, but it's more than just hanging out in nature makes us feel good. We know that there's a mental health benefit, but there's some strong suggestion from research that's coming out that the biological environment is really important for our health as well, because the organisms, the bacteria, the microbiome in the soil and in the surrounding plants gets on us and is good for us. It's good for us. So, and restoration can make that environment healthier for us to be in. So, for example, in this example from Australia, what these researchers found was that if you look at the soil microbiome in a cleared area that's basically all the native vegetation is gone, it's just been stripped down, and it's not an intact, diverse system. If you go from that and start restoring it to something that's more restored, and then even compare that to a remnant that has never been disturbed, what we see is the kind of bacteria, the microbiome, bacteria and fungi, that microbiome, shift from these opportunistic taxa, which contains a high degree of human pathogens. it shifts. You can see this wedge starts to shrink and become smaller. And this bluish one here starts to get bigger. And these are beneficial bacteria and fungi, a microbiome that's healthy for us. This is what's been called the old friends hypothesis, that we have evolved in nature, and there are bacteria and fungi that are normally on us that actually protect us from other pathogenic bacteria and help us with our digestion, etc. I mean, as we all are learning, even our gut biome controls a whole lot of who we are, and we don't even think about that most of the time. And it's coming from nature to a large degree. So you can see here, you go from a cleared landscape where you have mostly these opportunistic and pathogenic bacteria, and as you go up here, we have more and more of these niche-adapted beneficial bacteria and fungi that are in remnants and in restored areas. So this is really cool research that shows that not only is nature good for us, but we can restore nature to be better for us. There are human benefits to it. Here's more on that. Same thing, different people, but really talking about this microbiome and rewilding hypothesis, the old friends hypothesis, that as you go from tree planting, grass, plant trees, it gets better, plant more trees, it gets better, you get a bigger diversity, and you have this huge diversity of microbiome that's beneficial to us. And that we interact with it by getting dirt on us, getting air on us from the environment around us. So even if you're in a city, if there's a restored park near you with high plant diversity, opening your window is a good thing. You'll get some of that on you, and that will be good for you. And that's what this is about. This is the whole microbiome-inspired green infrastructure toolkit. Some people have taken this another level and said, okay, if you're in a city, we need to take parks and restore them to higher diversity because that's where people are concentrated. And we will reap real benefits, health benefits to humans that are not just the mental health benefits, but the physical health benefits as well. And so on. People are just taking this idea and going with it. This was published in Science just a few years ago. And climate change, of course, is having a negative effect on people and a negative effect on ecosystems. But as we improve adaptation for biodiversity, we can strengthen these ecosystems, reduce the impact of climate change, and then hopefully get a positive effect on people. All right, so hopefully you're convinced that nature is good for us. A diverse environment will make us healthier. Well, how do we get there? Okay. One of the biggest challenges we face in restoration, and this might surprise you, is where do we get the plants? It's one thing to go in and kill all the weeds, and it's a whole other thing to get the things you want to grow there. And they're largely unavailable at the scales we need to work. And so that's actually what we do as an organization. One of our programs is around, we call them plant materials, so we can refer to seeds and potted grown plants. But plant materials is a huge demand in restoration. Without it, we can't do the restoration. We're limited. It's the weak link in the chain. It doesn't matter our intentions or how much money we have. If you don't have the seeds, you can't do it. So also, but where are you going to get those seeds? And what should they look like? What should their genetic composition be like? This is a little complicated because we want plants that will be adapted to a future climate, right? We need them to be resilient in the face of climate change. We also know that local adaptation is how plants work. In other words, when plants grow in a certain area that has a certain environment, they become selected to optimize their performance at that site. The genotypes that aren't so good at that, say maybe it's a drier site, they get weeded out of the gene pool. And so plants aren't generally locally adapted. But at the same time, we need to know that. We need to use local plants, but we also need to use plants that are going to be climate resilient. So how do we deal with that? So that's what I'll talk about now. So first off, this idea of local adaptation. You can test for signals of local adaptations at many different levels. And this was a project we were involved in that looked at common garden studies from species throughout the US, but concentrated in the Great Basin. And so we were looking in arid lands. That was the goal of the paper. And we wanted to know how often does local adaptation happen. And a common garden experiment is where you take plants from multiple populations, maybe far away, maybe local, and you grow them together. You grow them next to each other so that you can check for any differences between them that have to do with genetics rather than their environment. If they're all growing in the same place, they have the same environment. So their differences must be genetic. That's the logic behind a common garden study. And what we found is we looked at 300 studies, and we found that 95% of them showed variation among the populations. So populations vary from place